Lieutenant Dunbar wasn't really swallowed, but that was the first word that stuck in his head. Everything was immense. The great cloudless sky, the rolling ocean of grass. Nothing else, no matter where he put his eyes. No road, no trace of ruts for the big wagon to follow. Just sheer empty space. He was adrift. It made his heart jump in a strange and profound way. As he sat on the flat open seat, letting his body roll along with the prairie, Lieutenant Dunbar's thoughts focused on his jumping heart. He was thrilled, and yet his blood wasn't racing. His blood was quiet. The confusion of this kept his mind working in a delightful way. Words turned constantly in his head as he tried to conjure sentences or phrases that would describe what he felt. It was hard to pinpoint. On their third day out, the voice in his head spoke the words, "This is religious," and that sentence seemed the rightest yet. But Lieutenant Dunbar had never been a religious man, so even though the sentence seemed right, he didn't quite know what to make of it. If he hadn't been so carried away, Lieutenant Dunbar probably would have come up with the explanation, but in his reverie he jumped right over it. Lieutenant Dunbar had fallen in love. He had fallen in love with this wild, beautiful country and everything it contained. It was the kind of love people dream of having with other people, selfless and free of doubt, reverent and everlasting. His spirit had received a promotion, and his heart was jumping. Perhaps this was why the sharply handsome cavalry lieutenant had thought of religion. From the corner of his eye, he saw Timmins duck his head to one side and spit for the 1000th time into the waist-high buffalo grass. As it so often did, the spittle came out in an uneven stream that caused the wagon driver to swipe at his mouth. Dunbar didn't say anything, but Timmins' incessant spitting made him recoil inwardly. It was a harmless act, but it irritated him nonetheless, like forever having to watch someone pick his nose. They'd been sitting side by side all morning, but only because the wind was right. Though they were but a couple of feet apart, the stiff little breeze was right, and Lieutenant Dunbar could not smell Timmins. In his less than 30 years, he'd smelled plenty of death, and nothing was so bad as that, but death was always being hauled off or buried or sidestepped, and none of these things could be done with Timmins. When the air currents shifted, the stench of him covered Lieutenant Dunbar like a foul, unseen cloud. So when the breeze was strong, the lieutenant would slide off the seat and climb onto the mountain of provisions piled in the wagon's bed. Sometimes he would ride up there for hours. Sometimes he would jump down into the tall grass, untie Cisco, and scout ahead a mile or two. He looked back at Cisco now, plodding along behind the wagon, his nose buried contentedly in his feed bag, his buckskin coat gleaming in the sunshine. Dunbar smiled at the sight of his horse and wished briefly that horses could live as long as men. With luck, Cisco would be around for 10 or 12 more years. Other horses would follow, but this was a once-in-a-lifetime animal. There would be no replacing him once he was gone. As Lieutenant Dunbar watched, the smallish buckskin suddenly lifted his amber eyes over the lip of his feed bag, as if to see where the lieutenant was, and satisfied with the glance, went back to nibbling his grain. Dunbar squared himself on the seat and slid a hand inside his tunic, drawing out a folded piece of paper. He was worried about the sheet of army paper, because his orders were written down here.